This program is brought to you by Bible Way Media, overseen by the elders of the Chipman Road Church of Christ in Lee Summit, Missouri. Thank you for joining us today here on Coffee with Zach and Russ. Hello again, we do want to welcome you back to Coffee with Zach and Russ. I do not have a cup of coffee in front of me, though, but I will as soon as this is over. I know that's epic failure, right? It's funny. We named this Coffee with Zach and Russ, and many times we are drinking coffee. But the person who drinks the coffee more than me right now, which kind of is funny, is Lisa.
Yeah.
She drinks a lot of coffee. One morning she told me, I'm really tired. I said, well, let me make we had a pod, the pod you can use. I had one of those espresso ones. Well, let me put one of those bad boys in there. We'll wake you up. And so I did that. And when it's finally ready, she took a drink of it and she's like, oh, wow. Okay. Yep. That's good.
Ready to go.
Ready to go. But yeah, I mean, I need to have a cup with me. It's been a long day, busy day. Not long isn't bad, but busy. But a lot of stuff going on. As we were talking before, this is August. We got coming up here in September. I mean, September's right around the corner. You got the 39th Street lectureship, and then we have Olathe. I was telling you earlier, when it gets closer, well, it's not that far away.
It's really not.
Is it 3 weeks? Is that what it is?
I think we're about it's a month out because the Ladies' Day is the 27th, and we're recording here on the 26th, so we're a month.
Okay. Well, let's tell you what. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about your gossip meeting, who's speaking, when it is, and we'll just make that announcement every time until it is here.
Well, coming up on Saturday, September the 27th, there's going to be a Ladies' Day at the Olathe Church of Christ, 515 West Park Street, Olathe, Kansas. Sister Sheena Brownlow Dindy is going to be doing that. And so we're excited to have her come and do the Ladies' Day. And then that following Sunday, September the 28th through August the 1st, we'll be having a gospel meeting with Terrence Brownlow Dindy. Excited to have Brother Terrence come. I was thinking the other day how long I've known Terrence, and it's probably been about 10 years now I've known Terrence, and so appreciate him. He's a elder in the Lord's Church. Of course, he's the director there of the Texas School of Preaching, and I know he's going to preach the truth, and we're looking forward to that. And so, of course, anybody's in the Kansas City area, come by and see us.
I think I met Terrence. I believe I met him through his sister there in Oologah, brother. And that was, that was probably 12 years ago. So roughly about the same amount of time, I guess. I think when we got to Oologah, he had just done a gospel meeting there for them. And so I think we've known him about the same amount of time. And so, yeah, that'll be a great meeting. And I've heard Terrence several times have been able to, I think him and I have done a podcast episode once or twice somewhere. I'm sure I have. I usually rope somebody in for something. And so I'm sure we've done one before. But he's doing a good work down there in Texas with all those good guys down there with him as well. And so look forward to seeing him up here in September. And of course, right before that is the Midwest Lectures. Midwest Lectures kind of leans right up into that gospel meeting there. The Midwest Lectures begins the third Sunday in September, going through Thursday, looking at lessons from the Old Testament. And so that'll be very, very good. And so I'm sure you can find more information on that on their website as well. And so if you're in the area, of course, feel free to attend that lectureship as well. As we continue our series, last week we began looking at the topic of temperance. We've been looking at much more than that. We've been looking at things to add to your faith, as we've looked at in the last several weeks. And I'm trying very hard to do my best to make sure we can do this on a more regular basis.
Yeah.
Zach, as I always say, he's the one who 99% of the time reminds me, hey, we need to do a podcast. Simply because everybody gets busy and you want to do all these good things, and sometimes we just get a little bit sidetracked. But we are here this evening continuing looking at the topic of temperance. Last time when we were together, we defined temperance, and we also looked at the importance of temperance. And so tonight we'll be looking at areas where temperance must be applied. If you look at Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26, he says here, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath. Temperance needs to be applied in the areas controlling the temper. When I read verse 26, it is so hard, depending on what's going on, of course. If you can get so worked up sometimes about something, it's hard to calm down. I don't mean in the sense that we're just filled with rage, but we're so worked up, or we're concerned about something that's taking place. Maybe it's disappointment that's caused us, or maybe it's concern in a local congregation. And temperance, we have to be able to control our anger, no doubt, but I think we have to be able to control our mind in general. When before COVID came along and ruined a lot of good things, the gym I used to go to when I was in Oklahoma was open 24 hours a day, 6 days of the week. It was open 24 hours. And so there were a few times, and weren't a lot, thankfully, that if something was going on that was really worrying me, I was stressed out about, and I couldn't sleep, I'd go to the gym and work out some frustrations or some stress or whatever. But we have to be willing to control that, control our temperance, control our attitude, our anger. And I use going to the gym those few times. Like I said, it just happened a couple of times. It wasn't like I was going to the gym every week late at night because I was angry about something. But I would go there to help try to release some stress and to control my temper, and to try to work things out, in my mind, so to speak. Because in verse 26, he says here, be angry and do not sin. I think it's interesting that he points out here that you can be angry, but you can do it and not be doing it in a sinful way. When Christ went into the temple and he saw the money changers and everything that's going on, he had, as we call it a lot of times, righteous anger. He flipped the tables. He was clearly angry. But why was he upset? Because of what they were doing in the temple. Christ was not sinning when he did those things. The Bible said he drove those people out of there because they were the ones who were actually in the wrong for doing the things they were doing. And he mentions there, I'm going to paraphrase that, in my house we called a house of prayer, but he made it a den of thieves. And that's why he flipped over the tables and drove them out, those kinds of things. But it was a righteous anger. It's a great example of be angry and do not sin. But also he says in verse 26, I'll make this final point and I'll be quiet for a little bit. But he says, do not let the sun go down on your wrath. We have to, I don't say this as if I had this all figured out, because I can say quite plainly there are times that it's hard for me to, when I go to bed at night, if I'm upset about something, to be able just to turn it off, to turn the mind off, But he says here, do not let the sun go down on your wrath. We have to make sure that we're angry about something, that we bring it to an end. We don't allow that anger to fester and to stay for just days and days and days and weeks and weeks and weeks. We have to bring it to an end. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Brother Zach, add anything like, and I'll be quiet.
You bring up that verse there in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26, where, Paul writing to the Ephesians, be angry and sin not, let not the sun go down in your wrath. And, you already brought out the point that, it's okay to be angry. There are going to be things that happen in this life that make us angry, but you bring in the temperance aspect, the self-control. That's where being angry and not sinning comes in, right? That's you're going to be using temperance. You're going to be using self-control. And I think about James chapter number 1 for just a moment, because we're going to probably use this verse again, but I want to use this verse in reference to the wrath aspect. James chapter number 1 and verse number 19. There James writes, wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Now, again, how is it that I'm going to be swift to hear? How is it that I'm going to be slow to speak? How is it that I'm going to be slow to wrath? Well, the only way that I'm going to be any of those things, swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, is if I apply temperance in those areas. And a matter of fact, if you look at the next verse there in James chapter number 1, verse number 20, it says, for the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. And so when you don't apply temperance to your life and you allow your anger, you allow your temper to get out of control, you allow that wrath to get out of control, James is saying that's not what God is. Now, that's not what God's about. And you brought up the great example. Not to say that God has never been angry, because clearly we see times in Scripture where God is angry, right? I made mention of this at Olathe Sunday. You think about Uzzah, right? Uzzah reached up and touched the Ark of the Covenant, and the Bible says that the anger of the Lord was kindled against him. So clearly we see the Lord is angry. You brought up Jesus flipping the tables in the temple. Clearly he is angry, but controlling that anger so it doesn't go from anger to wrath. So it doesn't go from just being upset about a situation to now I'm involved in sin, and now I'm not behaving as a Christian would behave, because that's what verse number 20 of James chapter 1 is all about. The wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. But what is a Christian trying to do? They're trying to be Christ-like. They're trying to do the things that Christ would have, that Christ would do. And so obviously, temperance, self-control, as far as our temper is concerned, as far as our emotions are concerned, that's something that we have to work on. And I'll be the first one to tell you, that's something I have to work on. Sometimes if I'm not careful, I have a very short fuse, and that's something I have tried to work on over the years. So I'm not saying that I'm perfect at that, but I'm telling you, it's something that we have to work on. And temperance is a big part of that. And I'll turn it back over to Russ.
And you're right. And I say this all the times when I teach when I do a class or a sermon or something, that when I talk about something like this or something similar to it, I want people to understand that we're not saying these things as if we are perfect in this in and of ourselves. We're always trying to do better in every area of our lives, and anger is one of them as well. And I was looking here at Proverbs 16, verse 32. It goes right on what you were talking about. It says, "He who is slow to anger," he says, "is better than the mighty, and he rules his spirit than he who takes a city." And so he puts the emphasis there of how this person who controls his anger is better than, he says, is better than the mighty. And which to me tells you how hard it is to control our anger sometimes, if the person who does is better than the mighty, because that's how hard it is to do. And there's a lot of reasons we can become upset. There's no need to go into that because that list is endless. But we do have to do our very best to control those things. We go on to read there about the tongue in James chapter 3, verses 1 through 12, and then James 1, 19 and 20, and how dangerous it is. I'm going to turn over here for just real quick, but James chapter 3, he talks about the untamable tongue, right? As some Bibles have that heading there. He says, "For we all stumble," he says in verse 2, "for we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body." And he talks about in verse 3 and following, how we control horses, how we control ships in verse 4. And he says in verse 5, how even so the tongue is a little member and it boasts great things. And he says, "See how great a force a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and is set on fire by hell." And he begins to talk about here, goes on to talk about how powerful the tongue is. What we say can have tremendous impact on people in a positive way. You can take the person who is just struggling, and they're almost as if in a figurative sense their face is to the ground, but our words can lift them up. The Proverbs talks about here, and I'm paraphrasing because I didn't think about this ahead of time, but it talks about how an encouraging word is it can mend bones and those kind of things. It's figurative in a sense there, but it is talking about how encouraging positive words are. And so, but at the same token, negative words, angry words, it's like taking a sledgehammer to someone's self-esteem. It can just rip them apart and humble them so very quickly by the things we say. And I say humble them, I mean, really, I'm talking about anger. Our angry words can hurt a person so quickly. In many ways, our words hurt much more than physical pain oftentimes does. It's the things that people say that hurt us the most. As preachers, people, I can say I've never been assaulted physically, but I've been attacked with words more times than I can count. And sometimes people say some very unfair, unjust, not only wrong, but just unfair and unjust things. I've had things said about me. I've had things said about even my own family, which to me, you can say what you want about me, but when you start talking about my family, we have a problem. And I think any guy probably feels that way. But the point being is words are extremely, extremely, extremely powerful. James 3 points it out. James 1 points it out. We can destroy or we can build up with our words. Brother Zach?
Yeah, just wanting to add to what Russ said, you talk about the tongue and self-control. And let me give this passage before I forget it, the one that he made mention of, just so if you're taking notes, you have it. But Proverbs 16, verse 24, pleasant words are as a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and health to the bones. And so,
There we go.
again, but how are you going to be able to say pleasant words? Well, if you have self-control. And, going back to the James 3 passage and even the James 1 passage, I think about these passages here in James chapter number 3, the first 12 verses, right? Is an interesting set of verses, because when you stop to consider them, I mean, James takes the time to explain the power of the tongue, right? He gives the illustrations of the ship and how it's so big, but yet it's moved by such a small rudder. And he gives the illustration about the bit that a man would put in a horse's mouth, and that the horse will obey because of that tiny little bit. And then he even talks about how the tongue is a little member and it boasts of great things, and yet how great a fire it kindled. And so James uses those three things. And then something that is always interesting, that I always think is worthy of explanation, where James will go on to say there in, now I just had the verse number 8. There it is. I'm sitting here looking at James 3 in the hole and like, where'd that verse go? But James chapter 3 and verse number 8, but the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. I think this verse requires some explanation, right? Because is God ever going to give us a task that's impossible to do? No. We're clearly, James chapter number 1, verse number 19 says that you need to be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. And so we can apply self-control as far as our tongue is concerned. But the point that James is making here, you could spend a lifetime trying to tame your tongue. But if you're not careful, if you let your guard down for just a moment, something is going to come tumbling out of your mouth that's going to cause you a world of trouble. And so it's so important, when we talk about self-control, that the tongue is there. And I love the way that this book has lined it out, because he talks about using temperance in regards to our temper, in regards to our emotions, and then he talks about it in regards to our tongue. Well, oftentimes when we say something that we shouldn't say, why is it? Because we're angry, because we're emotional. And so as a Christian, one of the most important things that we can do is strive each and every day to use temperance, to use self-control in regards to controlling our tongue. One illustration that my grandfather used a long time ago in one of his sermons that I'll never forget in regards to the tongue. He would say that your words is like toothpaste from the toothpaste tube. He said, you can get that toothpaste to come out of the tube really, really easily. But have you ever tried to stop and put the toothpaste back in the tube? It doesn't work. And so if we don't use self-control in regards to our tongues, we're going to say something that could have, if we're not careful, let's be honest, we could say something that can have eternal consequences. And so self-control is so important when we think in regards to our tongue. Russ?
Yeah, and we're going to make, I just pointed out many times already, we're going to make mistakes from that. And I say this a lot, I think, in every area of our lives, we're trying to work today in such a way that tomorrow we're a little bit better in whatever area we're trying to address. I don't think we can improve in 12 areas from one day to the next. We can improve in one or two areas from one day to the next if that's what we're focused on. We pick something we recognize in our lives that we need to do better at, or we need to rid out or whatever it may be. and we work to make it better, every day. And here, with reference to our temperance and our anger, controlling it better every day, our tongue, controlling it better every day, and lastly here, controlling our desires. 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 12 says here, the Apostle Paul says, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought into the power of any. And so it's really about, I probably have said this before, but we own our possessions, but we should not allow our possessions to own us. We don't allow them to control us. I have my phone set in front of me. I'm using it for the podcast this evening, but how many people, myself included, spend way too much time on our phones. I brought this up before at Chipman, and I said, if you want to humble yourself and you think you're doing good with your phone time, open up your phone sometime, look at the screen time, and see how much time you've been on there. The phone doesn't lie. If you've been on there for 6 hours in one day, it's going to tell you. And so, but we have to be willing to work to control those things, because intemperance causes a whole list of problems. We can talk about how it causes drunkenness and retaliation and angry words, all these other things. But we want to, I think the idea here is the Christian always wants to be under control. Whether we're talking about anger or tongue or desires, we always want to be under control. Now, like Brother Zach, make any comment you'd like before we close out here this evening.
Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to add. Sometimes other people can just say it better. And so if you'll allow me, just let me read this section here. Brother Winkler in his book wrote this, and I think it hits the nail right on the head of what we've been talking. But he just says, intemperance causes drunkenness, immorality, gluttony, retaliation, angry words, and hasty deeds. And you think about just not controlling what we do. It leads to all sorts of things. I mean, you can see it. Oftentimes we don't think about this, right? But go back to the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter number 3, when Satan there is tempting Eve, what does she lack? She lacks self-control. She sees the food, that it's good to eat, and that was desirous to make one's wise, and she lacked self-control. I mean, really, when you start thinking about a lot of sins, aren't they because of self-control? People that have an issue with, let's say, pornography. Why do they have an issue with pornography? They don't have self-control to give that up, or drugs or alcohol or any other thing. It's a matter of self-control. And again, I'm not saying, as I'm not an expert by any means, because there are certainly areas in my life that I need to exercise more self-control in. But I think sometimes as Christians, if we're not careful, we overlook the importance of having self-control in our life. And so I just want to leave with those thoughts, to just challenge myself, to challenge our listeners. Try to have more self-control in your life for whatever it may be. Just try it. And I think you'll find out on the other side of it that you'll be glad that you exercise self-control. And as always, before Russ closes out and sends us home, I want to express my thankfulness for our viewers and their willingness to turn in and listen to us every other week when our podcast airs.
Yep. Well, I agree 100% with you, Brother Zach, and we're going to continue looking at temperance next week, or next time, rather. Lord willing, when we come back, we'll be looking at how we can cultivate temperance. And so we thank you for your time with us here today on Coffee with Zach and Russ. We hope this has been encouraging to you. We'll see you, Lord willing, next time. We thank you for joining us today. We hope you have enjoyed this program. You can find out more about Byway Media by visiting us at bywaymedia.org. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find all of our podcasts on all major podcast platforms. As always, we thank you for listening.